Hello and welcome to the Total Soccer Show. My name is Daryl Grove and I am solo in studio today. Taylor has started coaching on Fridays, so the plan is you're going to start hearing a lot more interviews and guests on the Friday episode. Today's guest is someone I've been looking to talk to for a while because it's a guy whose work and way of seeing the game in this analytical but accessible way I really admire. His name is Mike Goodman, a writer you may know from ESPN FC, from Grantland, and more recently from FiveThirtyEight. He also co-hosts a podcast named Double Pivot with his friend Mike Cayley. You'll hear us talk about all these things and more on today's episode. The more is we also talk US men's national team, where to deploy Christian Pulisic if we want maximum impact, and whether or not a back three is worth a go. We talk Premier League and the big tactical trends of the season so far, and we talk expected goals, what it is, how it works, and why you should care. Taylor and I will be back on Sunday night / Monday morning with our weekend roundup, but until then, please enjoy today's show. So on the phone, I've got Mike Goodman. Mike, finally, after several emails, welcome to the show.
Hey, I'm happy to be here. Glad this worked out.
And I sent you an email about the list of things to talk about, and I realised, looking at it before we started recording, it's kind of long. I just want to double check you're still good with the many, many topics we're going to cover. US men's national team, your career, Premier League, all that.
Oh, yeah. Listen, if you've listened to our podcast, you know that I have no problem talking on a variety of topics for a long time.
All right. Well, that's why I wanted to talk to you. Well, first up, I want to start with your career. So I first became aware of the name Mike Goodman when I read a story on Grantland titled The Evolution of Cristiano Ronaldo. And it was, correct me if I'm wrong here, because I haven't reread it. Probably should have done more research and reread it. But I remember it was you describing how Ronaldo at Real Madrid, this was in 2015, is no longer the sort of the dribbler that everyone remembers from the early days. He's much more now sort of almost a centre forward who's a lot more economical and efficient. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, that's about right. And I think that's sort of in the last maybe season or two become somewhat common wisdom that he's sort of evolved. But I think I was looking at it. I think it was a little clearer in the numbers when I was first writing that piece a few years ago than it sort of became to the eye test as the years went on.
Well, that's why it really got my attention. This is one of the first places I saw that. And then as soon as I read what you'd written, I watched him and I was like, oh, yeah, Mike Goodman's right. I should follow this guy and pay attention to what he says. But I guess the name Grantland obviously rings a lot of bells for people because it kind of has this sort of mythos about it. And I was thinking that was a perfect use of big name celebrity player and some sort of good nerdy analysis, like the kind of stuff that I love and I assume our listeners love. So I really wanted to ask a little bit about sort of how you got hooked up with Grantland and sort of how soccer was treated there.
Yeah, so, I started at Grantland. It's sort of the fairy tale story of everybody who writes on the internet.
You ran into Bill Simmons on the street and started chatting soccer?
No, Chris Ryan, one of the editors there, had written something about soccer, and I critiqued it on a website. I wrote my own thing based on what he said, and I said this is why Chris is wrong about a couple of things, basically. I did it nicely, but that was what it was. And afterwards, he reached out to me and asked me to pitch him some ideas, and I basically never stopped pitching them. That's really how I got connected to Grantland, and Grantland was really my first steady paying soccer writing gig, which was freelance for a little while, and then ultimately they brought me on staff.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know you were on staff there.
Yeah, so I freelanced for them for about a year, and I think by the time the Ronaldo piece was out, I was a staff writer there, their soccer writer, writing a couple times a week.
And then my memory of sort of, especially the Bill Simmons angle, is that he kind of was into soccer, but not super deep into it. He doesn't have the deep knowledge about that he maybe does about other things.
It was a generalist site, right? And I was sort of the soccer writer there. But, I think behind the scenes, there were more than enough sort of knowledgeable people, Chris Ryan, Ryan O'Hanlon, who I worked with a lot, who absolutely knew their soccer stuff and created a really good environment where, even though I was the only person sort of, religiously consuming soccer as my job on a daily basis, there was absolutely the infrastructure there for me to write well about it and have my writing be well edited and improved by the people, behind the scenes.
And did you have sort of an easy thing where it was, here's your column, put whatever you want in it, or was it sort of you had to pitch and be heavily edited or that kind of stuff?
It always depends on whether you're freelancing or on staff, and that's not just Grantland, that's everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So certainly when I was freelancing, I would, email them regularly with pitch ideas. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? Would you be interested in having me write about this? And it was a process. And then, when I was on staff, it was much more of a, all right, like once a week we have a phone call, we sort of hash out ideas. Here's what I'm thinking. Here's what you're thinking. What do you want to write about? What do we think would be good on the site? And it's a very collaborative process.
And then obviously Grantland sort of very suddenly, at least from my perspective, went away. So, I mean, if you're comfortable talking about it, can you tell me sort of what that was like? I assume you're on staff, right? So did you get much warning, or did it just happen one day? Or
I mean, I think I don't think it's a secret that given that Bill Simmons had left ESPN by that point, everybody sort of felt like the writing was on the wall. But I mean, publicly talked about what happened. There was a phone call on a Friday, and they announced that they were ending the site immediately. And then the press release went out to the public that the site had been ended. So, the end was very sudden and disorienting. Yeah. But I think that most people at Grantland, and I shouldn't speak too specifically to this because I was never on site. I wasn't in the office. I always worked from remotely. But it does seem to me that the expectation was that Grantland's days might have been numbered, but the suddenness of the ending was quite surprising.
I see. Okay, so it's like waiting for the hammer to fall, but it came a lot sooner than expected.
Yeah, a lot more quickly than expected.
and then I know now you're writing for FiveThirtyEight, right? Which I believe, I may have this wrong, is also ESPN owned or affiliated in some way. So
yeah, so I've had a long and varied career within ESPN. I'm freelancing for FiveThirtyEight among other places at the moment. But after Grantland, I bumped over to ESPN FC for a while, and then I spent a year at ESPN Insider, and then my time at Insider ended when ESPN had the massive round of layoffs. And so now that my contract is over and I'm back to writing about soccer, FiveThirtyEight, I had a prior relationship with them while I was at ESPN, and they've been happy to have me freelance for them going forward, which is great.
Oh, great. And for the record, I really like your stuff on there. I always read it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I heard the US men's national team is stumbling towards the World Cup. Yes,
that is about right.
So I do want to talk a little bit about the US national team while I've got you here, if that's good with you. So the big thing that I think is going to be the question going forward, and I'm asking this because I also saw that you saw the Spurs Dortmund game.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is Christian Pulisic, and where should the United States be playing him? Because we saw him on the wing in the last two games and it wasn't necessarily effective. We've seen him through the middle. We saw him, I believe, on the left for Dortmund against Spurs, and I had this feeling that he was sort of always briefly impressive in flashes, but there was no actual result, right? Like a lot of his balls across the top of the 6-yard box didn't quite reach Aubameyang, and vice versa. So if you were sort of Bruce Arena going into that Panama game, where are you looking at placing Pulisic and why?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't think that Pulisic necessarily has a specific position that he's best at. I think it's much more about what do you need from him on the team, and what do you anticipate the game being like in order to then get the best out of him. Like, I wouldn't say that like his best position is right wing or his best position is attacking midfield. I would say against some opponents it's better to use him on the right wing. Against some opponents, it's better to use him on the in centrally in attacking places.
Okay, and so what's the criteria for that then?
Yeah,
I know it's hard to give specific examples because every game's different, but like, is there a certain type of opponent playing a certain way or with certain characteristics where he's better on the wing? And the same question for better in the middle.
Yeah, I think that if you're going to have a lot of the ball and be camped in the final third, it makes a lot of sense to have Pulisic out on the wing. And I think that's a little counterintuitive because you think if you have a lot of possession around the 18, you want him in the middle of things. But part of what he's very, very good at coming in from the wing is unsettling set defenses. Beating a player off the dribble, sort of like getting to the byline and playing a cutback, those kinds of actions. So I think if you have a lot of the ball in the final third already, then being able to use him coming in off the wing, either the right or the left, I'm slightly more inclined to play him off the left wing if you want him to be more of a goal scorer, and off the right wing if you want him to be, more of a provider.
Is that because he's right-footed, so from the left he naturally comes inside? Right.
Although he's pretty darn good with both feet, so it's a weak preference, right? Like, but that's where I think he's best utilized from the wing. Now, if you're going to be playing in transition, right? If maybe you think that you're going to have to sort of hit on the counterattack, then having him be able to run those transitions is good, right? Like getting him in space in his own half to then turn and run with the ball against unsettled defenses is really effective. Now, the problem you have there, right, is that it's hard to play him behind two strikers if you're going to be defending a lot, because he's not, he's an attacking player, right? He's not a great defender. So then you have to decide, maybe we're going to go sort of with a 4-4-1-1. Maybe if we want to play with two strikers, we sort of say Pulisic is a winger and we stick him out on the wing, but his job is in transition to sort of come to the middle of the field, receive the ball, and run transitional play. But I think that the U.S. is going to have to end up using him more as a player that runs counterattack transitions than as sort of a winger camped in the final third in its biggest moments. Just because usually the U.S. in its biggest moments has less talent than who they're playing against. Now, in qualifying, that shouldn't be the case. And when they're hosting Panama in like their biggest game in 20 years, you would expect them to have a lot of the ball, and I would expect Pulisic to spend a lot of his time breaking down the set defenses.
So, I remember the game against Honduras in March. I think it was March, the 6-0 win. I believe Pulisic was sort of central number 10 behind two strikers, and then the only other central midfielder was Michael Bradley. That's right. Behind him, and it felt really risky going in. I was really nervous when I saw the lineup, and then obviously the goals started flowing, and all was good.
Right. Once you're scoring goals in that, it's fine. But yeah, it is. It's a gamble to take that you leave a lot of space in front of your own back line, and the U.S. has had its back line challenges. So it's worrisome. I mean, it is worrisome. And so I don't know that given the U.S. personnel, there's a perfect solution, but I do think that like Pulisic is so good and so promising that whatever sort of solutions you do come up with, whatever approaches you have, it has to be sort of centered on maximizing what he can do.
And what about Michael Bradley? Speaking of maximizing what someone can do, it seems like the story of the last 5-6 years has been sort of what should we do with him and who should be next to him. And I wondered if you had a take on that. Like, are you impressed by Kellyn Acosta, for example?
I am impressed by Kellyn Acosta, and I think that is sort of the pairing of the immediate future. Bradley's a little bit of a challenge. I think the problem under Jurgen Klinsmann, at least, was as Bradley got older, Klinsmann still wanted to use him as sort of this do-everything midfielder. And he didn't really have the legs and the range to continue to do that on a regular basis. Arena has sort of tasked him with a much more specific task, right? He's sitting back as a more traditional sort of deep-lying playmaking midfielder. And I think that makes the most sense in terms of getting the most out of him. But like we were just talking about, if it's just him, he has so much space to cover in front of the defense. I mean, it really helps him when he has a partner. Of course, there are other trade-offs all over the field, but I think that the idea of somebody like a Kellyn Acosta in sort of a traditional 4-2-3-1, where Bradley's somewhat more of the deep-lying playmaker and Acosta, gets up and down the field as he can absolutely do, is the way forward.
So if we had another Michael Bradley and we put him next to him, then you could say the US would play with a double pivot. Is that fair?
That is right, yes.
Because I wanted to ask you about the podcast. It's affiliated with Howler. It's you and Mike Cayley, so the two Mikes. And if you ever considered maybe changing one of your names to make it easier. But it's,
the confusion is part of the fun.
But I think it's a really good show, especially for the type of analysis you just gave, right? The Ronaldo analysis and the US national team analysis you just gave. I realised that, I listened, but I realised that I never got the backstory as to how and when and why it started.
It started just before the last Euros. I found myself between contracts, and we're friends, and we didn't think that there was a podcast like this out there, and we just decided to give it a try. And we really enjoy doing it, so we keep doing it. I mean, there's really not much more than that. We both sort of, I think, a lot of people group our work together, and it is similar. We both sort of deal in the nerdier side of stuff, in numbers and tactics, in specifics. Yeah. But I think that we also approach it slightly differently, right? He is very much, he builds, statistical and analytical models, and I do much more sort of analytically informed journalism. So it's two sides of the same coin, and I think it works really well together when we sort of, put that combined expertise onto a podcast. I mean, it's clearly a little bit niche, right? Like you really need to want to spend like 25 minutes listening to a breakdown of a specific Spurs tactical tweak or something. But that's what we do.
But I genuinely think, and this is the reason I like Double Pivot, is that that's how podcasts should be, right? Because I think there are more and more podcasts, specifically soccer podcasts, coming out, and they're just trying to sort of, have a chat about the big issues of the day, and it all just starts to blend together. And I think the more niche and focused it can be, then you're sort of enriching the conversation more that way, rather than just trying to sort of just cash in on talking about Neymar.
Yeah, I think we made an active decision that we didn't want to just sort of let's hit the 5 big stories of the week and because I don't think that's not how either of us sort of approach following the game. I don't think it's how either of us approach, working in and around the game, writing about the game. And so I think that, it's a specific decision on our part to sort of bring what we view as our specific and unique expertise to an audience.
And I wonder, did you do any podcasting before, or is Double Pivot the first thing that you guys have done?
It's definitely the first weekly podcast I've done. I think both of us have done, sort of guest spots and whatever on various shows. But part of it was we wanted to develop this skill. And if we were going to develop this skill, we wanted to do it under our own control. Right. Yeah. So it's definitely, a project where you just get reps doing a podcast every week. And I think that that's really helpful. And, for anybody who is sort of thinking about podcasting, we are so much better now, a year and change later, 70 episodes, I think, later than when we started, like so much better. And so it really does.
What type of things have you learned? And what type of muscles have you developed over your 70 reps?
I mean, I think it's a lot about how you interact naturally. Because the vast majority of the episodes, right, are just the two of us talking. Sometimes we have guests. Sometimes we have, sort of guests for an entire show. Sometimes we do a guest segment. But, the show is built on the two of us having a conversation. Yeah. And we have conversations all the time. But once you get on mic, you really need to be able to focus on how you interact with each other and make sure it's not just taking turns talking at each other. Yeah. And developing that organically is, it takes time. It takes practice. It takes effort. It takes sort of self-reflection and listening to yourself do it and thinking about it to develop, that sort of rapport. Even among the two of us, we're friends, right? We have that rapport off mic.
So, I would say from my perspective, I've experienced the exact same thing, is that when we first started out, it was kind of like you have this feeling like you have to do some sort of professional presenter voice or sound like the guys on TV. But then you kind of realize that the guys on TV are just sounding like other guys on TV, and people are much more interested in hearing an actual proper conversation where people aren't self-conscious and are just sort of having the chat they would normally have.
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, I think we talk about it a lot, that sort of being authentic is important.
Yeah,
right?
That's the word, yeah.
People want to, to the extent that we have a committed audience, and we have a decent audience, people tune in, we think, to listen to the two of us talk about soccer. They don't tune in to listen to soccer, and it happens to be the two of us talking about it. That's sort of our position on how we want to build an audience.
So one of the things you guys are very good with that we on the Total Soccer Show are a lot more shaky with are statistical concepts like expected goals. So I did talk to Ted Knutson, maybe, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly,
that's right.
a year ago, and he gave me a good explainer. And I felt like I had a grasp. You know when you sort of have a grasp of something but don't fully grasp it? Some of it is slipping through your fingers.
Sure, absolutely,
so can we do it this way? Can I sort of explain how I understand it, and maybe you can correct anything that's wrong and maybe then fill in some of the gaps? Does that work?
Absolutely. Lay it on me.
Okay, so my understanding of expected goals, and this is a conversation I had with Taylor after a soccer match a couple of weeks ago, and our friend Seth, who I know listens as well, is that each attempt at goal is given sort of almost a percentage value that's almost like 0 to 100, or 0 to 1, I guess, in terms of how difficult it is based on variables like the distance from goal, the angle, the number of defenders. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, no, that is right. What I'd say to you, though, is you're buried a little in the specifics. And the general idea here is a very simple soccer concept that everybody understands. And that's an argument. Everybody argues about whether or not a team deserved to win, right? That's one of the classic soccer arguments, right? Oh, well, this team won, but this other team deserved to win because they had more shots. Well, but actually they had more shots, but their shots were worse. Well, were they worse? That conversation, that back and forth is something that's very sort of organic to the sport. And was
expected goals a deliberate attempt to sort of counter that, or to add layers to that argument?
It's not even to counter it. I think it's a deliberate attempt to quantify that idea, right? right?
Okay, yeah.
To look at that conversation and say, okay, let's ground it in something we can measure. And the power of expected goals comes from the fact that over the long term, it's pretty good at predicting stuff, right? It's pretty good at looking at the chances that a team has. And if they've scored more, you can say that likely they're not going to score. They're going to come back to their expected goal numbers as they go forward. If they've scored less, you can say with a pretty high degree of confidence that actually, as they go forward, they'll score more goals than they have been. And so the power of the statistic is that it grounds that conversation in something that we can say is pretty accurate going forward.
So one question I have is the final statistic of if you say there is a game, say it's Arsenal-Cologne from yesterday, right, and it finished say 3-1. When you say that Arsenal's expected goals for that game, is that simply adding up every shot they had? And then adding all the expected goals numbers up to the total you arrive at. Is it as straightforward as that, or is it more complicated?
It is almost as straightforward as that. Some models, that is what they exactly do. Other models, what they do is they handle rebounds somewhat differently, right? Because if you count up the expected goals from a shot and a rebound and another rebound, boom, 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 you're sort of overcounting the expected goals, right? Because if the first shot went in the net, you wouldn't have those next two shots. So some models account for that a little bit. But yeah, for the most part, when you look at the expected goals total of a match, you're just looking at the total of the shots that a team had.
And so I'm also going to assume, so I really like the idea of it. I like it even more now that I understand it a little better, I think, after this conversation. But no statistic is perfect, right?
That's right,
So
sure.
One of the things that struck me as I was just thinking about it is, what if there's a certain player, I'm not sure, I mean, maybe Son for Spurs, right? Who is, for some reason, very, very good at scoring at the near post. Just to pick
just to pick a random example that has nothing to do with soccer that's happened recently.
Yeah, exactly, right? But so wouldn't like the expected goals from that weird angle be like presumably quite low? But for some reason, he's very good at scoring from that. Basically, can specific players' skill sets break the model in some way?
The answer that I would say to you, there's considerable amount of debate over this. The answer that I would say to you is yes, I absolutely believe that to be the case. I believe that Son, for example, can be better at shooting from tight angles than expected goals would predict.
Right.
But the other thing that I'll say to you is over the course of a season, over the course of a career, over the course of 10 or even like 5 to 10 games, one, there aren't going to be that many shots that he takes from those positions. Two, there might be other shots where he's worse than expected goals that balance things out. And certainly we're looking at a team level, he might have teammates who from certain situations are worse than expected goals would predict. And three, other teams are going to learn that as well. And part of the sort of the coaching process is the point counterpoint and the planning and counterplanning where you try to take away things that other players are good at. So Son is going to have less of those opportunities, and perhaps even those opportunities might be better defended than you'd predict. Yeah. And it would sort of act to counter that. And so what ends up happening over the long term, over a season, is that all of those factors go into the expected goals and they kind of cancel each other out. So when you're predicting, it's not a big deal. Now, for a shot or a game, absolutely, you can look at an expected goals total of a shot or at the end of a game, and you can say, okay, I think it missed this thing, and this is why I think that expected goals, sort of doesn't give them enough credit, gives them too much credit, whatever. But over the long term, those things come out in the wash.
Okay, I could buy that. I could definitely buy that. So I also noticed expected goals has started appearing more and more in soccer coverage. Not so much in the US, but I think on the BBC Match of the Day or maybe a Sky Sports coverage of a Premier League game, I think I saw it listed. Wait, can you remember which one it was?
I believe it was Match of the Day, but I'm not 100% sure.
I thought the first week of Match of the Day, I think I saw it sort of.
Yeah, in the statistics scroll at the bottom of the. There's been a push. for a couple of years, but it's broken through this year, and it's Opta, the data collective company, has something to do with this. But in general, there has been sort of this push to have it become more of a part of soccer coverage. And I think that that's good. I mean, there are always challenges as things become sort of more widely distributed. Not all fans are going to want that. Not all fans need it. In my opinion, it can add to coverage, but as we have this conversation right now, right? Like, part of adding it to coverage well is having a good grasp of what it does and presenting it the right way. Exactly how firm the conclusions that you draw from it should be versus shouldn't be. So
yeah, so you can't have like Gary Lineker and Alan Shearer just suddenly start having a deep XG chat if they're not that familiar with it.
Exactly. And look, it's not just them. I think most major media companies, when they deal with sports, they have stats people behind the scenes. And part of that job is to make your analysts as comfortable as you can with these concepts. Because if you're presenting them on TV, you want to present them well, right? Like, you don't want to just put numbers up for the sake of putting numbers up. Yeah. What you want to do is use them to further sort of explain the game, to explain situations, to give you another data point to help you talk smart, to help you be smart about what you're talking about.
Are there any? Yeah, that makes sense to me. Are there any other sort of statistical models or things like expected goals that we, someone like I am not aware of, or anything that's sort of on the brink of the mainstream?
Yeah, there's a number of things that say like teams will do behind the scenes that aren't public, or that are sort of. One example I'll give you is FiveThirtyEight has their model, where they sort of develop an offensive and a defensive ranking for teams. And what we've been talking about is what I would call shots-based expected goals, which goes into it. But there's also something called non-shot-based expected goals. And the idea of that is, look, when you add up all the expected goals of shots, you're doing good work and it's pretty good, but you're missing this whole idea that, like, sometimes a team can play really well and their possession and their passing and their moves just don't quite end up being shots. Or sometimes a team can play fairly poorly, but the limited amount of possession that they do have can result in a lot of shots. And that's not always going to be the case. So part of what you can do is measure more sort of holistically, how likely do we think it is going forward that possession will turn into shots, and then those shots into expected goals? And so part of what FiveThirtyEight's model does is they have this thing called non-shots expected goals, which I think you can tell from how I'm explaining it to you is slightly less intuitive. Yeah. But it's important because it's important. It's an important link to understand how all the things that happen on the field lead to shots, right?
So is there a basis for calculating that then? Because, like, so for example, say a team has 80% possession and really does pass it sideways for 90 minutes, like in that Simpsons episode.
Yes. Yes.
Versus a team that has a lot of possession and it's like really sort of dangerous and it's in the final third, but for some reason there's just some standout like centre-back pairing that just will not let you through. Like, is there a way to differentiate between those things?
It's a difficult challenge, and there's a number of different ways of approaching it, of sort of varying levels of simplicity. Like, one of the easier things you can do is you can just break down possession by where you have it on the field, right? Yeah. Like, if most of my possession is in the attacking final third, well, that's going to be a better sign than if most of my possession was the center backs passing it back and forth to each other. Right. So that's part of it. Another sort of method is something called possession chains, where what you're really doing is looking at sort of sequences of possession, right? So what do we do between the time we gain possession of the ball and lose possession of the ball? Do we move it up the field, right? Are we moving quickly from defense to attack? Or when we have it, are we playing a lot of these kinds of sideways, not dangerous passes that don't actually lead to having the ball in more dangerous areas? Now, as you do that, it gets further and further away from sort of the typical language of soccer, and it gets harder to sort of explain in a fairly simple 2-sentence way like you can with expected goals.
Yeah.
So
part of it's packaging, right? I think it just needs like a fancy thing. Like, I got quite into packing stats, and I think it just because it had a really good name. And I think possession chain is something that people could get behind just as a branding. It's always very political, right? You just got to have a good name for your policy.
Let me tell you, the amount of time that nerds spend arguing over what to name their statistics is mind-boggling.
Oh, wow.
It's a very real sort of part of the field, for better or worse. But sort of expected goals won that argument, but people had all sorts of different ideas for what the name should be. Is this the right explanation of what it is? Should it be
Mike,
like...
I've got to ask you, what were some of the runners-up for expected goals?
I think that chance quality is one that a lot of people felt fairly strongly about. That using the term chance quality better explains the idea that what you're doing is you're measuring the quality of all of the chances.
Okay. It's not as exciting, I don't think.
Yeah, and it doesn't have this hook of sort of like of hooking into the idea that common fans have all the time of who deserved to win, right?
Yeah.
Like, who would you expect to win? And I think that's sort of been the power of the name of expected goals, which I think is a pretty good name, sort of, when it's all said and done.
Sorry, I cut you off because I couldn't let that go without getting one of the runner-up names. Because I'm fascinated by that kind of branding stuff as well. Where were we going before I interrupted?
I think we were talking a little bit about chains of possession and sort of the idea of ways of measuring what you do with possession, the speed with which you move the ball, where you have it on the field. Packing, which you brought up, is part of that, right? Yeah. Like, it's a stat that's supposed to help you measure how dangerous the passes that you're playing are. And that those concepts are absolutely the kinds of things that get folded into more advanced non-shot based models.
All right. Okay. Have you got time to talk some Premier League, Mike? I know we're running slightly long here.
I can do it. No problem.
All right.
Yeah.
So I know you guys watch the Premier League really closely. I'm assuming you can't watch every match every weekend, but I get the feeling you watch quite a lot of matches.
I watch a lot. Yeah. I don't watch everyone, but I would say I watch about 7 out of 10 matches in a given Premier League weekend.
Ooh, 90 minutes or condensed or?
I'll watch 90 minutes, but 2 at once.
Oh,
usually.
Wow. I cannot do that. I find myself going back and forth and not being sure which screen I should be watching.
So what I say to people is, it doesn't matter how many games I'm watching at once. I can tell you what 2 teams are doing.
Just 2 total out of however many.
2 total teams, right? So like, oftentimes what'll happen is, like say Chelsea will be playing Bournemouth and Arsenal will be playing, Brighton Hove or whatever.
Yeah.
And so what I'm doing is basically, at the end of the day, I'm walking away with a pretty good feel for how Chelsea and Arsenal played, and not as good a feel for how the 2 mid-table teams played.
Okay.
Which is why I also try to watch as many mid-table against mid-table matchups as I can, because you want to have that sort of grasp of how everybody's playing.
Oh, it's maybe more interesting to see them play against each other, so you don't see them sort of under extreme stress.
That's a huge part, I think, of soccer analysis, is that there are just so many teams out there that people sort of only watch when they're playing against good teams, right? Like, you would have a very different sort of understanding of, say, Southampton or Everton if the only times you watch them play were against the top 6 versus if you watch them play against the rest of the league.
Yeah.
And so it's important to have that balance.
It sounds like I'm talking to someone who has an NBC Sports Gold subscription as well.
Oh, I do. Absolutely, I do.
Because there's the exact games, right? There's the exact games we're talking about. All right, so what are we 4 games in, I believe, to the Premier League?
Right.
Have you seen any like tactical trends, either league-wide or specific teams that you did not expect to see? And maybe it doesn't have to be tactical, but any trends that you did not expect to see when the season started?
I mean, I think the big thing, and I'm not sure it's to this season, but it is overall from last year, the end of last year into this year, is the sort of evolution of the back 3 in the Premier League, which has sort of made a really big comeback. I think there are reasons. I mean, it's made such a big comeback that it starts to feel silly describing it as just a back 3. Like, in the same way that, like, you wouldn't describe, that team's playing a back 4 and, like, expect that explains how they play. And I think that we're getting to the point with the back 3 now where it's the same thing. Watching Chelsea play, and they don't want a ton of possession. They're happy to focus on the wings, and they create very specific kinds of attacks. It is very different than watching, when Pep Guardiola and Manchester City run out a very possession-heavy back 3, which also builds on a lot of crosses, but they play a very different way in a different style. So I think that's one of the bigger things that I'm looking at this year is not only the development of teams playing with three center backs, but the differing ways in which they do it, and sort of the blurring of the line between what we traditionally think of as a back 3 and a back 4.
Yeah, is that a lot about sort of maybe a defensive midfielder stepping in between to sometimes be there and sometimes not be there?
What I think what's happened is that was what teams had evolved into doing a lot, right? Maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, where the center backs would split very wide and a midfielder would drop between them in possession. Now I kind of think what's happening is they've decided, well, instead of doing that, we're just going to play three center backs, one of whom can pass really well, and one of whom is sort of, I think of like Jeff Cameron, who's playing on the right side of Stoke's back three, who is sometimes could play as a right back and has played as a right back in the past. And you think that the way Stoke plays, it's very close to playing in a traditional back four with Jeff Cameron as a right back and Eric Peters as a left back. It's just slightly rotated a little bit so that it's really three center backs with Eric Peters as the wing back, and then they play a truer winger on the right side in the right wing back role.
Okay, so it's like a slightly lopsided thing, but it all makes sense because it's all planned.
Exactly. And so it's really the blurring of the lines between a back four system with one conservative fullback and one attacking fullback, and this new system where we sort of have a back three, but it looks a lot like that.
So what would you categorize what Arsenal are doing, like sort of late last season and early this season?
I have not been impressed with their back three, and I think this was another trend that numbers picked up very quickly, which was that when Arsenal last year had initial success switching to a back three, it was somewhat of a mirage, and that the performances were not as good as the results.
I got the feeling it was kind of just like someone had just maybe shocked them into action, and like the switch of formation was just like, somehow like shocked them into doing something as opposed to solved anything.
Yeah, there's a real question as to what the purpose of this switch is. And I still don't have a good answer to it. I think it functions all right when they have a lot of the ball, when they're attacking a lot, when their center backs can step up to intercept out balls rather than have to defend behind them.
Right.
But I don't see what benefit they've really been gaining from playing that way as opposed to the way they play traditionally. And it's sort of hard for me to come up with a solution that isn't, well, everybody else is doing it.
Yeah, because I look at it and I think if I was going up against them and I had sort of maybe a couple of big strikers or one big striker, I'd be saying, maybe you drift towards Monreal, who for some reason is the left centre-back, and we're going to aim balls at your head.
Yeah, and I think that, to be fair, that's a weakness of a lot of three center-back systems. I mean, Cesar Azpilicueta is playing as one of Chelsea's three center-backs, and he's not big. Mm-hmm. But other teams seem to have, teams that implement it well have a system for dealing with that, right? They have a way that they protect themselves. Whereas it'll be interesting to see as Arsenal get healthy whether it gets better, right? Because like opening week of the season, they were starting, Monreal, Kolasinac, and Rob Holding as their back three, and that's a real problem. when you're playing, when Mustafi comes back, and now that Mertesacker is back, and when Lauren Koscielny's healthy, when you have more talent in that back three, I wonder if it will be perhaps harder to exploit. But even if that's the case, I have a hard time seeing like, why are you doing it? Like, what is the reason what's the benefit you're getting out of it that you don't get out of your normal back four?
Yeah, so I would say like when Chelsea did it last year, the big benefit to me seemed to be the freedom that suddenly Eden Hazard and then whoever was on the other side, like maybe Willian or Pedro, suddenly they had a lot more freedom because they were almost like two playmakers with no worries about having to trap back and be that wide guy. So to me, the benefit was immediately obvious there. Yeah,
I think that's right. And the other thing is that when Chelsea did it, they had and have a midfield where they can play two of their midfielders against three of yours and not lose the midfield battle, right? Their midfielders are so good and so rangy and especially defensively great that you can't exploit what should be a weakness. And so when they do that, then they have these immediate advantages in wing play, right? They have these immediate advantages where because they can get Moses when he's healthy down the field, or whoever they play at wingback, they can provide width more or less without risk. That means that Hazard and Pedro or Willian can move all over the field and freelance and create all sorts of problems. But it all flows from understanding where your strengths and weaknesses are.
So if you'll indulge me a second, I want to sidetrack us a little bit. Taylor and I had a conversation yesterday. We were answering a listener question about why the US, because of the lack of quality fullbacks, why the US doesn't go back three and go wingbacks. And my argument was that the reason you don't go wingbacks is because a wingback is just a fullback with a much harder job. So I wanted to kind of get your take on it. Is that something... and I'm not asking you to necessarily confirm what I said. I'm really interested in opening up the conversation because I didn't get a great response from listeners after that answer. Like, it was not a popular answer on Twitter. So I wanted to get your feel for it.
It's tough. I think the danger of doing it in a national team setting is simply that if your players don't have a lot of experience with it, even if you develop a good plan, it can be very hard to implement.
Okay.
And like for a long time now, the majority of players would come into a national team camp with experience in the back four. Does that change now that more teams are moving to a 3 center back system? Like now that Jeff Cameron goes out there every week as the right side of a 3 back, maybe it does. So I think that's part of it. And actually, to be fair, Bruce Arena has occasionally played 3 center backs. He will do that if he feels like the situation calls for it. The other thing, though,
that was more like a back five, though, right?
Yeah, it was more like a back five. The other thing, though, is like I think when DeAndre Yedlin's healthy, he's a good right back. He's a good international level right back, and he gives you the things that you need out of a right back. So then it's just the left back problem, which absolutely is a problem. But I would be hesitant to change an entire team system that you think works because you don't have a good enough left back.
Yeah,
and because then you're putting a lot of changes in motion and creating the risk for a lot of other problems to solve one very specific problem.
I guess based on our conversation today, you've sort of made me realise the importance of having a strong central midfield if you're going to do this, because you kind of end up especially with the 3-4-3 type thing, you end up sacrificing the centre. And even with our back four, we seem to be having trouble holding the middle. And even when it was Michael Bradley and Kellyn Acosta recently, it seemed like not enough bodies. So maybe we don't want to stretch that any thinner.
I think that's a real concern. And, even recently, the system that they played sort of demanded that the center backs step up to help Michael Bradley, and they did a very poor job. It was when it was Cameron and Ream, they did a very poor job of it that match. And I would be very hesitant to change systems in a way that exposes the midfield more.
Okay, while we're on it, is there any one thing you would like to see the US do, maybe over the next couple of games, or sort of as we get towards the World Cup? Is there any one thing that we haven't seen from the United States that you would like to see implemented?
If they qualify, I would like to see in a couple of friendlies experimenting with Pulisic in a free roll behind a single striker. I don't know if that's a system that will eventually work or not, but I think that it's good enough conceptually that I'd like to see it get some minutes and like to see them try it out to see if it works.
So this would be kind of like Maradona's role in '86, right? Where he's kind
a little bit. Not to put too much pressure on Pulisic, but I think he's so good, and he's so good at a number of things, and I think that they do have complementary wing type possession players who they can play on either side of him behind a single striker. Guys like a Nagby. Yeah. That I would just like to see them give that a shot to see if it works.
All right, so that would be in like the 4-4-1-1 you'd maybe mentioned earlier, something like that. Okay, I'm definitely on board with that. Sorry, I sidetracked us into US men's national team just because I know it's a fascinating topic right now, and I feel like
it's really interesting.
Yeah, you've always got good ideas about it.
I wish it was less interesting.
Yeah, right. I wish it was just like celebrating the goals, right?
Yeah.
Final thing on the Premier League, is there anything that has been sort of very predictable?
To me, Manchester United being good has been fairly predictable. They were a team that last year, I think a lot of us number nerds singled out as a team that had performed, whose results were worse than their performances. And that we sort of expected that even if they changed nothing, they would be an improved team this year.
Was that an expected goals thing, or were there some other numbers you were looking at?
No, it was an expected goals thing. That they were just quite clearly they performed. And, I think that this isn't like an undiscovered country here, right? I think there was talked a lot about in the media where they kept missing chances, right? And they weren't, but oftentimes in a non-numbers context that gets presented as being not clinical enough.
Yeah.
And I think
he's got to do better there, Mike. He's got to do better.
Exactly. And I think that when you take an approach like I take, or most people who are sort of familiar with stats, what they'll say is, well, if they're not being clinical enough, eventually they're going to be clinical enough again. That's the thing that's likely to change. You'd be more concerned if they were not creating the chances in the first place. So Manchester United being good is, I think, something that a lot of numbers nerds seized on at the end of last year and said, just like, even if they're just the same team next year, they're going to be better than they were.
All right. Well, I'm sure Taylor, my co-host, Man United fan, will be very happy to hear that. So, Mike, I know we've run a little long, so thanks for your time. Thanks for indulging me a little bit. Final question I want to ask you: is there anything you've got coming up? Any projects or things that are going to be published in audio or sort of written form that you want to highlight or let people know about? Plug away is basically what I'm saying. Yeah,
I mean, my main plug is always Double Pivot Podcast. You can find it wherever you find your podcasts. It's at Double Pivot Pod on Twitter. That's sort of a good place to check in with us weekly. I'll have stuff coming up around the web as the weeks go forward. I'm actually working on a project I'm excited about the sort of resurgence of the back three, which is why I had so much of that stuff to talk about at my fingertips.
Yeah, it did seem like a specialist subject you suddenly touched on.
Yeah, so you follow me on Twitter at the M_L_G, and I'm sure I'll have more information about that coming soon.
All right, Mike, thanks you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks, Daryl. This has been fun.